Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited today to have the opportunity to bring together four very distinct voices. Some of you are legal practitioners working in legal aid and litigation, and some of you work in policy and social legal academia. And the topic today is something that I think has become incredibly pertinent in recent weeks, particularly in mainstream discourse. And I think that it was very important for us to start off our podcast series by having a conversation about these issues. And so today we're going to be discussing the need for increased female representation in government and policy making, decoding structural and systemic issues. And so I think each speaker today, of course, has a very unique and very distinct expertise. But what I'm very excited about today is about the interplay that's going to be happening between the common strands that underpin each of your work, as well as to kind of explore differences and divergences. But before we do so, I think I'll start off with a brief round of introductions. So starting first with Dr. Maryam Khan. Dr. Maryam Khan is a social legal scholar on South Asia and a research fellow at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives, Ideas in Pakistan. She has an SJD from the University of Wisconsin and an LLM from Yale. Maryam's focal interests relate to comparative constitutional law and history, judicialization and legal mobilization in authoritarian contexts, ethnic federalism and law and social movements, and women's struggles in Pakistan. Maryam has published widely on these themes in international law journals. Her current book project relates to her doctoral research on constitution making in Pakistan and involves a public history component on oral histories with constitution makers. Secondly, Ms. Mehrunissa Sajjad is a barrister who has represented numerous victims of domestic violence, rape, and child marriage on a pro bono basis. Ms. Sajjad completed her BA Honours from the University of Oxford, where she was elected Vice President of the Oxford Union Society and also received the Vice Chancellor's Award for Women Leadership. Following this, she obtained a graduate diploma in law and was called to the bar by the Honourable Society of the Middle Temple. She has also previously served as the Secretary for the Lahore High Court Environment Protection Committee. She is an ardent advocate for gender equality and human rights and is involved in pro bono litigation and policy work in these fields. Nida Chaudhary is an award-winning diversity and inclusion advocate and the founder of the Women in Law Initiative Pakistan, which of course is the initiative that has given us the space today to have this conversation along with Qanoondan. She holds an LLB Honours and an LLM in Law and Development from the University of London. She has over 15 years of experience in research, training, and capacity building, and has provided legislative and policy input on several key women and child rights laws. Her areas of focus include, amongst others, gender-based violence, fair representation, and child rights. Finally, Aaminah Qadir is the founder of She/Her Pakistan, a public interest litigation firm that is dedicated to the practice of constitutional and criminal law. Her work focuses on women, religious minorities, the trans community, and the environment. Aaminah has completed an undergraduate degree in global affairs and history of art at Yale University and has studied law at the University of Cambridge. Thank you so much to all of you today for making the time to be here for this crucial conversation. I'm grateful because I think that each of you is going to be adding an incredibly valuable dimension to the conversation. And so I think before getting into the different strands that we're going to be discussing today, I think that it's very important to start off by doing a little bit of context setting. And so I'll be talking, of course, about the immediate context underpinning this conversation, but also about the broader kind of background that is at play here. So the immediate context for this conversation is, of course, the fact that an all-male federal cabinet has been appointed by the Prime Minister. There are all-male federal ministers. There is only one female Minister of State. And secondly, what happened after the composition of that all-male cabinet is that an 8-member special committee on legal and judicial reforms was constituted by the Prime Minister of Pakistan. So I'll talk a little bit about what the purpose and the aim of the committee is before getting into the issues of representation that are involved therein. So this committee purportedly has been set up to uphold the rule of law, ensure justice for all, promote transparency and accountability within the legal framework. And essentially the purpose here seems to be promoting access to justice for the common man and for all Pakistani citizens. And the committee has, of course, already had its first meeting, and the Prime Minister has taken notice of delays in dispensation of justice in criminal and civil matters, and has also said that reforms are imperative across criminal, civil, fiscal, and constitutional domains to streamline legal processes and to ensure swift and speedy justice. Okay, so I mean, having kind of discussed what the aims are and what this committee sets out to do, I think it's now very, very important to talk about who the members of this committee are and to talk about what the issues of representation therein are. So all 8 members of this committee are men, and it's a mixture of several kind of eminent senior lawyers. Then the committee is being chaired by the Federal Minister for Law and Justice, and it also has the former Federal Finance Minister, Mr. Isaac Dar. So, I mean, what really stands out about this committee is that there's no real consistency in terms of its membership. There does not seem to be any one criterion for what membership in this committee should be based on, because as you can tell, I mean, there's a mixture of lawyers, there's political representatives. So it's quite unclear as to what basis these members have been appointed on. And what's also unclear is what exactly the mandate of the committee is, because the issues that the committee is purporting to be dealing with are of a very broad nature, and there's no real, I think, kind of fixed mandate, which I think is problematic, but of course we'll talk about that. But that was just a bit of context setting, and I'll start off, with the first question, which I'm going to throw out to the group as a whole, which is a very general and broad question, but I think that it is the question that we need to be starting off with. And that question is, what are the issues with representation in an all-male committee like this one? And what are the reasons for calling for more inclusive representation and for women to be in policy-making committees like this one?
I just want to begin by also putting out some other bits to the context that you've laid down now. So it's 2024. It's not like these are issues that haven't been raised before. Particularly, I think from Women in Law platform itself, fair representation is something that we have consistently raised as a demand, and we have done several projects, including one with the Ministry of Law and Justice, to showcase and bring out the amazing female lawyers that do exist in the profession. And I think they were spearheaded by the government of that time. They took ownership of that, and first women law awards took place. And so the ministry it's not like they can say that they're not aware of the women, or that they're not aware of the issue, or this issue particularly being having put on the table. So I think this I would categorize as willful sort of disregard. I would have expected something along the lines of progress, but it seems we have regressed, and I think that's another concern that I put on the table.
Nida, it's also, I think that it's not just about placing women, right? I think the biggest issue is that the composition of these committees is often so politicized when it comes to issues like access to justice, when it comes to issues such as proper functioning courts. Even if one party, any party, comes up with a law or an amendment or even a policy that is ultimately beneficial or that is progressive, we see there being unnecessary opposition to it just because it is politicized in a very petty manner. And I mean, I agree that in terms of actual numbers and representation, we have regressed, and that's a huge issue in and of itself. But I think even if there were 1 or 2 women on this committee, it's not enough, right? Because at the end of the day, what happens is that the voices of these women are drowned. In order for women to progress or be placed on such platforms or committees, what we often see is that the women who are, this is not to generalize, but mostly it's women who are the most docile, kind of, they will go ahead with what the older men in on that particular platform are saying. We see them being kind of promoted and being placed on these committees. When it actually comes to women who are real disruptors or women who are calling for more meaningful, deeper change, we see that we don't want to, those women are left out of such platforms, and that is exactly what we need, I feel. And the issues coming specifically to this Legal and Judicial Reforms Committee, I mean, firstly, the issue is that the problem with having an all-male committee, obviously, is that there is no diversity, right? There is absolutely no one who's there to represent the lived experiences of these women. And of course, I mean, you will hear people present the argument that these men also know what it's like and the issues that women face or the issues that vulnerable groups face. But I mean, on the face of it, the chairperson of this committee has served in, bar councils, has been an office holder. What have they done? when it comes to promoting female representation. I mean, it's very simple. Like, you look at the background of all these people, they've held some very important offices in the past. What have they done in that particular sphere? Forget about women, other vulnerable groups. What measures have they taken in the time that they did have in power within over the matters that they had authority and jurisdiction on? Did they do anything to make things better? Did they, or I mean, are we just, you know, so I mean, I think that there has to be a lot of thought that goes into the composition of these committees. And I actually think worldwide what happens is that there is some sort of set kind of quota, or not even quota, but there's a set formula upon which these committees are composed, and we don't see that.
TORs for that matter.
Yeah.
But there's no transparency in the way these people are appointed. I mean, have you guys seen any TORs who has been plotted for this particular committee?
If I may just add to what Mehrunissa is saying, if you look at like two things. Number one, what is the need for a committee like this? Why are you making this law and policy committee? And the second is, once you've decided that you want to have access to justice or rule of law, then is this committee achieving that? So to go to the first point, what is the purpose of this committee? You're bringing this committee because you think that there's some laws that require, let's say, some kind of review, or they need to be brought in line with some standards that you've thought of. That means that Parliament, that's the supreme body that is supposed to be enacting these laws, you're recognizing that Parliament has not been able to do this, or there's been some gap or problem that you're seeking to correct. So that's the first thing. Now, in order to do that, you believe that the same people that have held these ministerial positions or attorney general positions, a lot of them are extremely capable and able. We're not speaking as to the competency of these people. The question is, are there equally competent females that could do the job? And if we just take the example, there's Advocate Generals of the province of Punjab, the largest province. She was a female. There are senators who are lawyers from the PMLN who are female.
Yeah.
If we want to kind of be in line with party politics. But on the second point, can these 60-plus-year-old men all have, not to be ageist, but can they address this access to justice problem? And here's why I would say no. And it's a follow-up of Meru's book, kind of what she has elaborated upon, which is that the main, as she says, these issues are politicized. So when you see these men coming together, what kind of has been their focus? In the past, their practice has been focused on, let's say, NAB laws, or their practice has been focused on tax, or it's been focused on particular issues of politics, which political, they might have represented the Sharif family in some cases. This is all fine, but is your practice alongside this also cases of domestic violence? Is your practice juvenile justice? Is your practice trans rights? If you're not thinking about that every single day, then how are you going to be thinking about those laws in that committee? Women will be thinking about that because we actually think when we go to work, if we have a child, where is that child going to be? Who's going to keep that baby?
Yeah.
There's a class element to this as well, actually. Like, I mean, when we think about access to justice, do we think about what about the people in the rural areas who don't have mobility, especially females, right? It's not as simple as going to a police station and launching an FIR or getting it registered, drafting the complaint. A lot of these people are not literate. So where are the voices that are representing the lived experiences of all of these people when it comes to access to justice or even the filing of complaints, right? When it comes to facilitating and making sure that the process is a seamless one. If someone who doesn't have transport or is dependent on a male member of the family to go and register a complaint, but if that complaint is against that male member or against that patriarchal setup and threatens to shake it, then how are we facilitating them? And we see this time and time again that there's a particular technicality in the way that complaints when you go to a police station of criminal nature have to be drafted, which shouldn't be the case, right? You shouldn't have to think and kind of manipulate the language of what you're saying to attract certain sections of the penal code. But in practice, that's how it's happening. And a lot of these people, like Aaminah said, that their practice has, mostly revolved around corporate issues or tax laws, NAB laws. Where is the exposure to, for example, the difficulties that people face when it comes to all of these other issues, which is what 80-90% of your population is facing on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. I think that's a very crucial point, because I think just tying together what both of you have said, I think that the issue really is that it all comes down to expertise, right? And it's about having the right technical expertise to address the problems that need to be addressed, whether those problems are looking at, what the procedural flaws are in terms of criminal law, whether it's, access to justice in terms of filing, a complaint, whether it's taxation, etc. So all of these things, I mean, that's what it really comes down to. And I think the notion that a committee like this one can be all male, while failing to recognize that certain expertise in these specifically gendered areas that you guys have spoken about is necessary in order to really bring about a coherent response in terms of policy formulation, in terms of the necessary amendments. I think that's crucial.
Right?
Absolutely.
We can come up with something on paper, and we've seen that time and time again. We've
Yeah.
had so many of these committees, and they've said we're going to do this, we're going to do that, but we don't see it actually, taking effect. And that is because, exactly like you said, there's a lack of. You need someone from all organs of the state there, right? To make sure that you have a comprehensive approach which actually translates into kind of being implemented practically as well, and not exist in isolation on a piece of paper.
Absolutely. So I'll come to you now, Dr. Maryam.
So thank you so much. Everything here I think has been a very, very comprehensive reaction to the points you've raised. I just want to kind of synthesize two issues and perhaps put them a little differently to give another perspective, right? So एक चीज़ तो ये है कि यहाँ पे clearly, as you've laid out, the big question or the big framing of what this committee is heading out to do is access to justice. This is a committee which is dealing directly with an issue that has to do with the power imbalance. And so should there not be an inward conversation and introspection about who the people sitting on that committee are and what kind of power holders and power brokers they are, right? And so there, of course, the question of gender becomes hugely important. So pehli baat to ye, you're talking about a power imbalance and you yourselves are engendering a huge power imbalance, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, and what Mehrunissa said, and I want to emphasize that, is कि law and policy एक ऐसी domain है जहाँ पे you could have some really fantastic well thought out laws on the books, and I would imagine that we do have a number of at least good starting points insofar as gender based laws are concerned, but there's a huge gap in implementation, and we've seen that over and over again, right? So this is a sociological aspect of law making and legal implementation which cannot be glossed over. जब आप implement करने जाते हैं law को, तो आपको पता है, this is a universal phenomenon, that there is going to be a disparate impact between what the law is saying on the books and what it's saying on the ground. A lot of it also depends on how it gets implemented, who implements it, right? And so there is going to be a slippage along the line of that entire trajectory, moving from the parliament down to where this law is getting enforced. And it is then extremely important to make sure कि आपके जो marginalized और vulnerable groups हैं historically, उनकी voice सामने आए, because वो disparate impact, it is impossible. I mean, I think expertise and competence have their limits when it comes to the ground up voice which basically tells you this is how this law's implementation has come to be lived, and this is the impact that it's having on the ground. So in that sense, I think diversity and inclusion in this day and age are inherent values. They have value in their own right. But I think there is also something to be said for the empirical angle. And there is a lot of data, at least in other contexts, which is showing you this is the law and this is what's happening down here, and who is getting badly and worst hit by that gap. It's your marginalized and vulnerable groups.
I said in 2024, we still have new government coming in, and this is the initial sort of stance they give us. Like, this is the initial messaging that comes from them.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Why? And
leaves so much to be desired.
Not
you kind
acceptable.
of like go one step back and you kind of ask the question, why is it that women are more likely to take up these gender-based violence laws? And if you take a step back and you look at, let's say, even the practitioners in this field or the ones who are most affected by it, can you name one top practitioner that focuses on gender-based violence issues or that focuses on trans rights? The top legal minds, so to speak, in Pakistan that are on these committees don't do this kind of work, which means that this work and these issues are not they're on the back burner for them. So that is just exactly why you need women and trans people on these communities.
But they draw their human rights, fame from the bar politics group that they come from, which is also, again, a woman's work.
To justice, actually.
Yes, and then now drawing on
Yeah.
her sort of work and basking in the light of that, I think that's also something that needs
Yeah, I mean that's a whole
Yeah.
separate conversation. But I want to just going off of what you guys have spoken about right now in terms of the gap when it comes to implementation of legislation and policies. I want to ask you a little bit about gender budgeting because I think that that's a very salient theme within this context. So if any of you would like to speak about the value that would be able to add.
I mean, just briefly, so we've had numerous amendments to the rape laws, we've had new laws come into place, we've talked about setting up of rape crisis cells when it comes to, child rights, we're supposed to have welfare bureaus, and I mean, this was the case at least about a year ago. Most of these child welfare bureaus, when you call them up, they don't have, the officials that they're supposed to appoint have not been appointed. They've come into being for years now. And they're not functioning as fully formed, empowered, institutions. And at the same time, when it comes to, for example, implementing things such as ensuring the presence of female police officers in every police station, such as the rape crisis cells, juvenile courts, all of this. You're making these laws in isolation, they get passed, etc. When it comes down to setting a budget for the implementation of these, and of course, right, you need a sizable budget if you are to fix things from the ground level. You need to pay people their salaries, you need to pay for the facilities. If there's supposed to be a room or a building that is dedicated to these people, you're supposed to make sure they have constant electricity, that's for one, information technology, all of this, it requires money. But it is simply not a priority. I feel like what you want to do is you want to compose a committee, those higher up in power want to say, oh look, these issues are really important for us. All the newspapers report it, you come on TV, you say 2-3 lines about it, everyone from that party or people on that committee can come and get, their pictures in the newspaper, and then that's really it. Some will go and, pass a law or propose some changes, they say this is going to happen. Now the problem is also that this is it's a political trick because the average person sitting in their home thinks, oh my god, itna zyada kaam ho raha hai mulk ke andar. But actually उन्हें तो नहीं पता ना कि आपने कहा था कि इतने क्राइसिस सेल सेटअप होने हैं या जुवेनाइल कोर्ट सेटअप होने और एक्चुअली ऐसा कुछ नहीं हो रहा. So I think budgeting is key when it comes to all of these issues, and actually if you're forming these reforms committee, why don't you have people from the ministry or the department that's going to be responsible for ratifying or approving of these budgetary allocations and include that as part of their, because I mean, Dr. Maryam also said, there's so much paperwork and some of it is great on paper, it's very progressive along in line with international standards, but there is no one who's willing, and it seems like even from the top, when these orders come from the top, that this is a priority for us. Domestic violence is a priority for us.
Yeah.
If it's a priority for you, the law itne saalon tak notify kyun nahi hua properly? Domestic violence ki FIRs abhi tak aapke police wale nahi kaatne ko tayar easily.
Exactly.
Why is this the case? Because you lack the will to actually see this through. So then you when it comes to your intentions or your purpose, they're not honorable when it comes to fulfilling the promises you are making to the public in such a grand manner.
Exactly, and I think, just talking about exactly that, the lack of budgetary allocation when it comes to issues that are seen as expressly gendered issues or women's issues, that's when an all-male cabinet becomes even more damning, right? Because that's where,
allocated.
yeah.
You know, where is the accountability for where
It's
it
being
is
spent.
Yeah, and also I would add, Maryam Nawaz is supposed to be having a mini budget. She's supposed to be passing it shortly. One, I have two mandamuses pending before the Lahore High Court. One is because of the lack of implementation of the Domestic Violence Act.
Yeah.
And the other is because of the lack of implementation of the Juvenile Justice System Act. Specifically, what's missing? The women's shelters, the helplines, the trainings you're supposed to give your judges and your police members. Now, without those trainings, how are you going to have a mindset shift कि वो FIRs दर्ज करें? अभी तो वो मुझे कहते हैं कि हाथापाई तो होती है शादी में, ये तो घर का मामला है. Up to the Sessions Court judges. Under the Juvenile Justice System Act, you are supposed to make rehabilitation centers and observation homes where you are to detain juveniles.
Yeah.
You are keeping them inside camp jail in a separate section. One of my clients has been in jail for 1 year. He's been held with adults, exposing him to the chance of sexual abuse and rape. And now, once again, as Meru pointed out, 7 years is taken to notify the act.
Yeah.
My cases have been pending for 1 year. The final result, I'm hoping, is that the High Court compels the government to allocate a budget.
Yeah.
But here is the point. You make great laws. You have laws for trans persons. You have laws for domestic violence.
Yeah.
And they're actually pretty progressive. The trans law is more progressive than any trans law. I mean, it's in the top out there in the world. But then when it comes to implementation, it's not a priority because, frankly speaking, I don't think the people in these committees or in these budget sessions, they think हाथापाई तो होती है.
Yeah.
So for them, domestic violence is not like, you're not understanding that you're suppressing and immobilizing 49.6% of your population and keeping them out of the workforce.
Yeah.
Aaminah, I represented a victim of domestic violence. It wasn't just a domestic violence case. Her daughters had been molested, etc. within that household, and she, wanted to file for khula and also put in a complaint for domestic violence. And it was obviously because she was living with those people at the time. She had her exit from the house and then going to the police, had to be timed well because she was genuinely scared for her life at that point in time. After assuring me on multiple occasions that when she comes to the police station, her husband is not going to be there, the DSP ambushed us, called him in the same room, and then 3 police officers, the SHO, the DSP, and someone else sat there pressurizing my client to go back to her husband. And I quote unquote, his exact words were, कि देखें जी टूटी हुई एक टांग आपको हॉकी से मार दिया उससे क्या होता है इंडिया पाकिस्तान में तो मर्द जला देते हैं अपनी बीवियों को आपके शौहर ने तो ऐसा कुछ नहीं किया so आपके literally a DSP is quite senior he's up there in the police right if he's sitting there and telling a victim of domestic violence whose daughters have been a victim of sexual abuse under the ages of 10 you sitting there and telling her to be grateful to this man, he didn't set fire to you. That is the mentality that we are dealing with.
Yeah.
Why was this man it frightens me and terrifies me that men with this sort of thinking are in these positions.
Yeah.
It makes my blood boil, frankly, just talking about it.
Yeah, I think it really exposes how fundamentally broken our criminal justice system is and how it's not equipped to protect those who are most marginalized. So I think, just going on from that strand, I want to ask you a question about a concept that has come up, I think, in academic and mainstream discourse both. And I'm going to just, throw this out to all of the panelists. There's often a distinction, right, that's made between female-centric, specifically gendered issues. For example, gender-based violence, reproductive health, issues that concern women alone or, to a very large extent, and other policy areas, right, when it comes to climate action, corruption, education. So my question within this context is two-pronged. The first part that I want to ask you is, in what way will increased female representation in legislative and policy-making bodies lead to the creation of better and more robust laws, specifically in relation to gendered issues, which you have already touched upon, in some of your answers, but I want to kind of bring all of that discourse together. And secondly, how will increased female representation in these legislative and policy-making bodies impact decision-making in relation to other policy areas like education, like climate action and the environment, like corruption, that aren't traditionally seen as, you know, specifically gendered issues. So how can we bring
I'd
about
really like to hear what
a gender inclusive
I
lens?
was really amused
Yeah.
by the question.
I mean, I have a very good example from our own constitution making history. I think that this needs to be highlighted more and more. The provision for local government in our constitution comes from an original provision in 1973 that was tabled, moved by just one person. This is one person who took to the floor, made this argument. There were no objections to it. It was, in fact, accepted there and then. And that was Begum Naseem Jahan, who was the daughter of Begum Shah Nawaz, who was one of the two female members in the first Constituent Assembly. So Begum Naseem Jahan was one of the 6 women who came on reserve seats in 1972-73, and your local government provision comes from her. She is the author of that provision, and it's very interesting because, number one, local government is a political institution. It's a question of governance. Here's a woman who's tabling it. Not a single other person had even thought about local government in that assembly. And not only is she doing that, she is then looking at the gender aspect and the vulnerable groups aspect within local government, right?
Yeah.
So she is the one who also proposes, in addition to that, a clause on special representation for peasants, workers, and women in the local
And
government.
eventually the youth and all those other
And of course,
categories that
those all come in
Yeah.
later on. They're sort of dovetailed onto that. So I think that we have to, first of all, rid ourselves of the notion that women are only there to speak on issues of gender,
Absolutely.
and to
Yeah.
make that segregation is very unfair. Ek to the empirical evidence kind of is contradicting that, right?
Yeah.
But I think certainly as an aggregate, और जहाँ पे हमारे पास critical mass हो ख़वातीन का और conducive conditions हो, तो then of course we are going to see them speak on issues of gender and vulnerable groups within these larger categories of governance, climate change, so on and so forth, which simply cannot be divorced from any topic of conversation now. So I think from both those angles, it's really absolutely necessary to think of women's representation not in a silo or segregated from like other groups, but really here is an opportunity and a space. When you create that space, women will also be better actors in terms of supporting a greater plurality, because they are also coming from that vantage point of marginalization and oppression, I think.
Absolutely. So I think, I mean, if anyone else would like to answer this question, just in terms of how it would benefit lawmaking in general, you know, and bring about a more gender inclusive approach.
Well, I mean, so we've had the defense of sudden provocation for the longest time in honor killing cases, and this entire jurisprudence was developed in the Supreme Court by all male judges that were there. And because we had the first female justice come out to the Supreme Court only as late as 2022, right? So for the longest time, and probably that still is a defense. It hasn't been overruled or anything like that. So probably in honor killing cases, you still find judgments that are still applicable today with these kind of defenses. They're not coming from any statute. They're not coming from any other jurisprudence, except for the fact that the male judges sitting and deciding those cases felt that, oh, this perpetrator was suddenly provoked by seeing his sister or wife in a compromised position or whatever, and then that became the basis of acquittal. So I think, and then of course when you compare it with the kind of jurisprudence that is now emerging from the Supreme Court, particularly ever since you have had more diversity on the bench, and then you see the impact in the two-finger test case. At that time, Justice Aisha Malik was in the High Court. And then Mansoor Ali Shah Saab, who was in the Supreme Court, echoed something similar in another case. So women have had impact when they are in such positions. And I can quote another example. The 2022 amendments, the sexual harassment amendments, the workplace harassment amendments, it was a room full of women from different parties, okay? And they were together, united in their demand for the kind of reforms that we were all proposing. I happened to be there in that room as one of the experts. I don't know how, but I was there, so I actually witnessed women from the PPP and PTI and everybody sitting together and proposing something which was advancing the cause of women in the workplace, and also looking after more vulnerable victims in terms of children and minor victims of harassment in education institutions, and also sort of vouching for informal labor, people who are sort of hired in the domestic arena. So all those rights were being demanded for, even the rights of former employees. Those who quit the workplaces, the women were advocating for their rights to be enshrined in the law as well.
Yeah.
And the main opposition that was coming was from the men in the room. And there weren't many men in the room. I mean, there were women also who were against what we were proposing. Particularly, they were against, expanding the scope to domestic workers. They didn't want to do that. But majority of the women were on the same page. And the few men who were in the room were really concerned about false accusations, of harassment being leveled against men, and they were just trying to focus on that. And so only because there were enough women in the room that they were able to push through those, concerns and get those amendments passed. So I think having women in rooms where decisions are being made definitely has a huge impact. And as we've seen, it's not limited to women's own cause, but it extends beyond
Exactly.
women, and they do advocate for rights of other marginalized or vulnerable groups. And if access to justice is what this committee wants to do, then this is the kind of approach you need. Otherwise, you do sort of second guess why such a committee has been formed, and you can't help but think that maybe it's for some specific political goals, because why else would you not have a diverse composition of people?
Exactly. No, I agree. Yeah. Go ahead.
To this point, Nida, that you mentioned about just to see the outplay of, let's say, you have these harassment amendments. Now, what was the purpose of making this ombudsperson? She was appointed to expeditiously decide cases of harassment and women's right to inherit property law, because your actual conventional justice system fails them. They're stuck in the justice system for decades. Here you have a caretaker government that jumps in and then removes her. She's not a political appointee. She has PTI affiliations. She is there to provide expeditious justice to females. The caretaker government removes her. The High Court issues a stay in that case. I was appointed as an amicus in that case and advised the court to restore and sustain the suspension of the removal, because she was put in for a particular purpose, and her purpose is not political. Her purpose is to provide justice. Now, for the last year, since she was removed by the caretaker government, I've had a case of harassment pending. Ironically, it's a women's empowerment group where a girl was harassed. The case has not been heard.
Yeah.
So to go back to the point of implementation, you come up with these amendments and these laws, and they're meant to do good and give a voice to the marginalized, but in the end, you're stuck in the same wheel where, whether it's the Harassment Act with regards to property, whether it's what Meru talks about, पिछले साल में 13 domestic violence cases की FIR reject हुए, 13 के 13. I went to the National Commission for Human Rights. They said they, different technicalities, found that they cannot help me either in the Punjab office.
Yeah.
And then that takes you back to the question: nobody can help women, right? Or nobody can help marginalized groups. So you gotta help yourself. And if you take it at the point of to go into the legal nuance of it, when Nida mentioned about Justice Aisha Malik's, outlawing the two-finger test. Now, the question is, had this come up before a male judge, would the same have happened? I don't know. I'm not sure. You can't say yes or no.
Yeah.
Frankly speaking, the violation of a woman's right to dignity or right to life, only a woman can understand.
Yeah.
And just the issues of gender that have come up just yesterday, Nida shared a judgment of Justice Aisha Malik distinguishing between khula and the dissolution of a marriage. And everyone, and I know this because I do khula cases every week in the lower court, everyone uses dissolution of marriage and khula interchangeably. But she clarified that a khula is a right that you have irrespective of a woman has, and it's not dependent on any kind of proving, cruelty, etc. Dissolution, you have to prove an additional layer But in that layer, when you prove that he's treated me badly, you are not disentitled to your dower.
Yeah.
Whereas in khula, you may give up your dower as a compensation for leaving the marriage for whatever reasons.
Yeah.
Eventually, I know this is a bit complicated, but what this gets to eventually is that you are financially ensuring a woman is empowered when she leaves that marriage.
Yeah, and in
Yeah,
this particular
absolutely.
case, it was half the
Property.
half the property,
Hmm.
half the rights in the marital home,
A
which is
huge
yes,
thing.
yes.
Yeah.
She gets half the house.
Hmm.
And she has gone from the trial court to the high court to the Supreme Court over a span of 15 years.
Yeah.
And then eventually a female justice distinguished.
Hmm.
And nobody even knows that khula and dissolution of marriage is used interchangeably in the lower courts because nobody's looking at those cases.
And they hear both cases in the same way. They want the woman to give reasons again
Yes.
and again, or
In
why she
every
wants to
case, she
leave.
has
Yeah.
to give reasons.
Yeah.
It's egregious, really. And I think really like my takeaway from everything that you guys have all spoken about cumulatively is that so we've established that not only is female representation necessary for the creation of laws that better protect women, but also for implementation and also for the necessary gender budgeting. So I think that that's a very crucial lens that a committee like this needs to take into account when it's considering the question of access to justice. But because we've also had the opportunity to talk about female legislators and their role, that brings me very, very nicely to my next question, which is for Dr. Maryam. Which essentially is based on the invaluable research that Dr. Maryam has done on the female constitution makers of the Constitution of 1973. And so my question is this: in terms of contemporary issues of political representation pertaining to women, which we've spoken about today, and the kind of framework that we have currently in the existing status quo, what are your thoughts on that framework against the backdrop of your research on women in parliament and in the Constituent Assembly in the early 1970s? And secondly, how does that work and that research speak to what you have to say about political representation in the assemblies and political institutions today?
Thank you, Noorzadeh. That's quite a huge question. I
Yeah,
hope that I can.
I was thinking
I
about
don't
that.
think I can do justice to it, but here's a start. So I think insofar as women's representation in the 72-73 Constituent Assembly is concerned, and mind you, that is those are the 6 women from whom at least 90% of your provisions on women in the Constitution are coming from.
Yeah.
At least in that decade,
Yeah.
right? And so when I did a first reading of the debates, it struck me. I was like, there is nothing like a women's caucus in this assembly. There are just 6 women.
Yeah.
And 4 of them are from PPP, 1 is from the Qayyum Muslim League, 1 is from the National Awami Party. And yet, there is a very sort of a, let's say, spontaneous strategic coalition that is formed around the question of the political representation of women, right? So one woman speaks on, we want greater representation in non-political institutions. That at that time included your National Assembly, the Senate, which was coming into formation at that time, and the Council of Islamic Ideology as well. And so one woman starts the conversation, 2 more at least will jump in and will add to that, will augment that conversation. And this is a trend that you see repeatedly in the debates, insofar as they are given an opportunity to speak up, and when they do, this is what is happening every time. And there are, of course, small disagreements amongst them along the way, but clearly what was being said earlier also, that you give women a seat at the table and you allow them that freedom to table their points, and you will see oftentimes a spontaneous collaboration happening on these issues. But of course that's not a given, and I think the reason why in the 2000s the conversation had progressed to, okay, we need a lot more reserved seats, right? 6 seats in an assembly at that time of like 144 or 46 is not sufficient. So we went to something like a 17% quota for women in the assembly, but you realize then that women being change agents on behalf of other women and vulnerable groups also requires certain conditions. You'd have to have the right incentives. So maybe in 72, 73, they had the right incentives, especially in the way that, other party members were treating their women members. They were putting a premium on them. So the election for a deputy speaker, when that happened in the assembly, there were 2 women contestants from the government and the opposition, right? So maybe it was a question of, these are women, they're not really related to anyone, any senior official in those parties. These are literally like very autonomous women who are brought in. And they are highly educated women, so there's a certain demographic. And so you see this sort of thing happening. That can't be taken for granted, I agree, right? So it's not just a game of numbers. Critical mass is important, but then incentives around that critical mass are also important, right? And there are a couple of really excellent studies on women's representation in the legislature in the 2000s going over till 2018. It is a bit of a mixed result, because the question is, okay, we've had this huge quota, why are we seeing these sort of limitations on the outcome? And the reason for that is, आप देख लें, in the most recent elections जो अभी हुई हैं 2024 की, उसके अंदर reserve seats have been allocated like you allocate favors.
Yeah, but that's
right?
been the case historically also.
Yes. And so what is happening now is such a stark illustration of completely undoing the good that you are doing in terms of representation, right? And in 1972-73, once again, it was Begum Naseem Jahan who said, why are we on reserve seats? Going forward, we are reserving 5% of the seats for women, but why are they not entering the parliament through a system of direct suffrage? And I think this is a question that we all need to consider in terms of incentivizing the right kind of outcomes. If you're giving women the seat at the table, what else do you need to actually make those outcomes materialize? Right? So I'll stop.
What is the incentive? What does that look like? Incentivizing.
So they have to have, I think, first of all, their own constituencies, right? So if they are fighting an election, the incentives completely change, because now they are no longer beholden to the male members who have indirectly not even elected them, just nominated them or appointed
Or
them.
then discredited, by saying ye to reserve seat.
Absolutely. And that's the kind of pejorative description that you see again and again on women constitution makers, right? Which was not the case in the 70s. I mean, these are women who are equal to their male counterparts at that time. And so you see over that arc, that sort of treatment being rolled back, and now it's a complete pejorative. There's a paternalism, कि ये तो ख़वातीन हमारी वजह से हैं. They owe their representation.
Constituency would come maybe more access to development funds as well, and so those women will be able to utilize and access those funds.
That's how it trickles down. But what you said is so interesting, because I can't imagine now in today's day and age people across party lines, like women at least on the floor, supporting each other. You rarely see debates coming out of parliament now. You have little to read as to why an act was passed, what was the ethos behind it. But as you say, in closed doors, in rooms, in consultations, you do see that when it comes down to it, they are willing to collaborate.
I think a lot has got to do with the Women Parliamentary Caucus also, that is
definitely
in bringing women from different parties together. I think they've realized their strength in this collective sort of forum. And it may vary with different sort of parties being in power or different times and different issues, but I think majorly it has done good for bringing women together on certain core issues. But then again, the caucus is expected to only advance women's issues or issues that are more feminine in nature or considered that women would be more concerned about. It's actually now, I think it should be about reclaiming space in everything else as well.
Exactly,
on all
definitely.
other issues, like this reforms committee, if it's the 18th amendment that they want to attack, or if it's the NAB laws or whatever it is, why is it not something conceived that a woman could have something to say about?
And if it's the 18th amendment, then why is the mandate access to justice?
Yeah.
Let's just be clear, like, why are we forming these committees? Let's just put the agenda out there. Because if you're really
The
trying
secrecy
to,
around them, you know, it's just.
I think the mandate is all over the place,
Yeah.
like particularly in relation to
But,
this
It's also
committee.
generic enough to
Yeah.
cover certain things and then not say too much either, because they're not coming clean.
I think it's
with
ad
what they're
hoc,
trying to
right?
do
It's
here.
like you come up with what you want to solve as you go along. But on that note, because I think that you guys have raised some incredibly interesting points, I do want to ask, how can we ensure the meaningful participation of women who are included
This is
in
my
these
favorite
rooms,
question.
and as opposed to what is called and widely perceived as just token inclusion?
Okay, so
Yeah,
can
go
I
for it.
first on
Yeah,
this?
go for it.
So, I've been studying child participation a lot lately for a project that I was doing, and from that I got thinking about women's participation as well, because I mean the concept of participation largely is the same, and you can easily draw the analogy. And in that context, I was reading about how participation is something which is a matter of procedure. You know, it requires consistent engagement in a manner where the individual or the group is able to actively engage and also have some sort of an influence in the decision making. And if not influence, at least there should be transparency and disclosure enough for them to know of the outcomes of their participation, so that it's not tokenism, so that it's not decoration, so that it's not manipulation. So like if you ask me what is not participation, it is all of these three things, and from the women's perspective, I added eyewash to it as the fourth category. That it shouldn't also just be an eyewash, that you are sort of coming up with a committee and co-opting members and then showing that the women are part of it, but then what happens about the proposals that they're sending in? There is that's not real co-option in my point of view, and I'm talking about the Judicial Commission of Pakistan and the committee that it made, where it then sort of co-opted other members, apparently all very fine senior female lawyers and judges and whatnot, but it makes no mention of what happens to the proposals that they'll be submitting.
And there's no reporting
There's
on
no
that.
reporting. Will those proposals be considered or thrown in the trash bin? What will happen? Like, there's no disclosure of also what has been submitted by them, and then what is the actual sort of final shape of whatever rules that they're trying to come up with. There is absolute silence on that, which is why I feel that that's not participation, that's not co-option, and that's not something that we can accept, because that's what an eyewash is, that you're showing that, oh, we consulted so many senior women, but what is the result of that consultation?
It's all for optics.
Yeah. It's all for optics, yeah. And so for me, that's what is not meaningful participation, and
I was just saying, if we look at just this committee, right? If you look at the policy reform committee, so what would tokenized inclusion look like on this committee versus what would meaningful representation be? You have an ex-law minister, you have an ex-attorney general of Pakistan. So would inclusion mean that you bring in members of females that have similar qualifications? If you do not have a female law minister ever, you can bring someone equivalent who is a female academic at the same level in law, or a female judge at the same level. If you can't bring in a judge who's a policy making committee, I take that back. But you bring in an advocate general.
You can bring former judges.
You can bring former judges. Good point.
Definitely.
So it does not mean to bring in someone just for the purpose, as you mentioned, of a token. The same effort you are taking to bring in what are top men, you bring in that same effort to bring in top women.
Exactly, yeah. So create a system whereby you lay down a minimum level, a minimum like criterion for qualifications or credentials or expertise when it comes to let's say 15 years of work experience having worked in criminal law, right? That's how you get
ex-finance minister there. If it's going to be, is it going to be looking at budget?
I think it is going to be looking at issues of taxation, so I don't want to criticize that too much, but I do think, I do think,
justice,
as kind of a part of that broader framework, which still needs to be determined.
But I mean, it's also worth looking into how successful that ex-finance minister was in his tenure when it came to recovering taxation from
Also, the token remains a token till you bring enough of them, right? So if you keep having that one woman or you give like that one state minister, it's always going to be a token till you actually
Exactly.
You see, in all these committees and also when it comes to judicial appointments, actually, people, whoever is responsible for, the person at the top for making these appointments, what they're thinking, and I mean, I may be wrong, but this is my take, is what committee can I form which will constitute a path of least resistance to anything that I want to do or propose, right? And that is how I think a lot of these commissions, committees, panels are actually formed. It's to see that this person is going to toe my line, this person, and I mean, that is not how change occurs. If you are not open to being challenged, if you're so insecure that you want to stifle any voice of opposition, then essentially there's no one coming and saying, hold on, what you're doing might not be effective. And perhaps these people don't, like I said, I actually don't think they want meaningful, positive change. It's just optics.
I think what you're pointing towards, I think the need is to press for some sort of structure or structuring at least the power of these people to constitute such committees.
Absolutely.
So that there are some checks and balances or some criteria.
It can't be unfettered.
It can't be so जिसे कहते हैं ना वो arbitrary.
I mean,
जिसका दिल चाहे आप बस घुसा दो उसको क्योंकि वो आपकी लाइन टो करेगा या वो आपके साथ डिसएग्री नहीं करेंगे.
या तो पार्लियामेंट करे ना. Why can't you do this work
yes,
in parliament?
the fundamental question.
I think you're right, like in that there are standing committees on law and justice that should be taking up these questions. But I think, obviously the cabinet is a different branch of the government, right? So if the Prime Minister decides that he wants to appoint a special advisory committee that's dealing with a certain, mandate, I think that's within his discretion, right? The real question is, how can that committee be made representative in the sense that it has actual efficacy to deal with the issues that it's purporting to deal with. So I think what you guys have mentioned in terms of political appointments, I do think that there should be a balance perhaps, like in the number of political appointments versus technocrats and specialists that are appointed to committees like this. I think that might help bring about some kind of balance and some kind of fairer representation to that. But
also, I just want to add to that appointing people to a certain committee is not the only way to solicit diverse opinions, and we just never think outside the box and think of an approach which is more people-centric, so to say. And you have all the digital tools and every other forum to disseminate information. Why can't we solicit proposals or ideas from maybe people at public at large, whoever wants to submit recommendations? Why are we not open with these processes?
And I have to go through those.
But we're not even open with the right to information.
Exactly.
That's the point, that this is not, like, the real agenda is not actual reform then, no?
Did that women in law ever get a response to the right to information request that they
No.
years ago? This was
No, we did not.
I think law reform is an activity that should be done in public view. If you can have Supreme Court hearings online, this is a conversation to be had through that sort of a forum, so that it's open to the public, and then you can have people comment on it, right? So participation and input, but with that certain kind of normative pressure that they will have to take it into account. That's one, and the other is women have to also have power. So those are two things. So they also have to be power holders.
Absolutely.
So both of those things I think are important.
So I think I will step away from my role as moderator just for a few minutes to talk about the very crucial international law framework that is at the heart of, I think, this conversation. And that context is basically that Pakistan has signed and ratified the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, also known as the CEDAW Convention. And the CEDAW Convention is actually one of the 27 conventions that is monitored by the European Union's GSP Plus framework. The GSP Plus framework, as we all know, is a scheme of preferential trade agreements that Pakistan currently benefits from in order to gain tariff-free access to the EU market. But what's very important to emphasize is that the GSP Plus framework is not, kind of an unconditional access to the EU market. It comes attached with a set of conditions. And what these conditions are is that beneficiary countries have to comply with a certain set of conventions that have been set out by the European Union in order to continue benefiting from tariff-free access to the EU market. So these conventions, I think, cover a very broad set of areas. They relate to human rights, governance, education, the environment. But what's important to kind of highlight is that even though the conventions are broad in nature, the obligations that they lay out for beneficiary countries and for countries that have signed on to these conventions are very specific. So let's talk a little bit about what the obligations and the commitments that Pakistan has signed on to under the CEDAW Convention are. And I think what's most pertinent here is Article 7 of CEDAW, which says, and I'll read it out, that states parties shall take appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in the political and public life of the country, and in particular shall ensure to women on equal terms with men the right to participate in the formulation of government policy and the implementation thereof, and to hold public office and perform all public functions at all levels of government. So all levels of government obviously has very, very kind of tangible implications associated with it. All levels of government implies that it's cutting across all the branches of government. So you're looking at representation in the judiciary, the executive, the legislature, as well as all of these policy-making committees and advisory committees that have been constituted by the government of Pakistan. And I think it's really important to emphasize, particularly within the context of GSP Plus, now that we have a newly appointed government, what the international law obligations are and what the government of Pakistan needs to do to comply with these obligations, not just in spirit, but also in practice, and what the tangible implications are in terms of increased representation for women, what the implications are of not affording them equal access to representation in these positions, and how that does ultimately have an adverse impact on the extent to which Pakistan complies with its obligations under CEDAW. Because what's very important to kind of highlight is that CEDAW has a very, very kind of comprehensive review mechanism. So I think that's an important context just to kind of lay that out there. But in terms of this, I mean, if there's anything that you guys would like to add in terms of, international law, any other instrument that you think might be worth talking about here, or anything else really that you guys would like to contribute.
Well, I did some work with Research Society of International Law. We were in a mentorship program and talking about judicial appointments, and because that had been the area that I was looking at last year. And I had the opportunity to look at the international laws on that point specifically. And there was a lot of regional work that was done in different, like in Jordan and other Arab states. There was a lot of international law as well on how judicial appointments have to embody the concept of diversity, and how, when appointments are being made, you have to be mindful of, including obviously the gender aspect is the most pronounced, but of course, we can see how other sort of vulnerabilities and marginalized classes can also be represented in these positions. In terms of Article 25 itself, which calls for affirmative action for women to be made. So we kind of question the JCP and all these people on the basis of these two things. That okay, so local context also compels you to think about women, and it's unfair for judges, they're always, or for judiciary to always be questioning, other institutions on fundamental rights, but then failing to incorporate these fundamental rights within their own institutions like the JCP. And then also there's that international law context to it, where you have even international law safeguarding these provisions in a way that ensures, because the world has moved away from the kind of technicalities that we keep using to gatekeep women and to sort of maintain the old guard. So I think there's a lot to be said on that also, that there is, of course CEDAW is more generic in scope, but there are specific laws and conventions from the perspective of judicial appointments. Like there are Latimer House principles, there are Commonwealth principles, there are so many other provisions that speak about having women in these positions and in these roles, that it's just strange that despite that, we conveniently forget to include women in these forums, and unless people like us make a noise over it, this wouldn't even be a conversation, you know.
I think they know.
They know, like I said, they know.
They can't possibly not know.
Yeah, I think that it's time to frame it not in terms of apathy or forgetting.
Yeah.
I think it's a deliberate, targeted, intentional exclusion.
Like I said, they're
Yeah.
blind
Yeah.
to the fact. उनको चाहिए नहीं है ना वो वाले perspectives इसलिए.
वो डाडी बहुत है ना खवातीन.
Aggressive international law.
Yeah.
Like we have also signed, so this views in all our cases that Pakistan is mandated by local law, and in addition, this is a domestic obligation that comes from an international law.
Yeah.
And so with CEDAW, even Article 3 talks about including legislation that ensures the equal protection of women and ensuring their full development and advancement. And
Absolutely.
Pakistan has also subscribed to Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, very importantly.
And they talk about Goal 5, gender equality, empowering all females, the Beijing Platform for Action.
Yeah.
There's no dirt on the
International
obligations we have.
Absolutely.
And just one figure, we've actually fallen in our women's political participation ranking. From 2006, we were at number 37, and this year the World Economic Forum in 2020, I think, on this year noticed that we are at 93 from 37.
That's a huge drop. Yeah, that's really disconcerting. But also on that, just in terms of the Global Gender Gap Index for 2023, we are now the 5th worst country in the world for gender equality. So that's a really great note to be ending this podcast on. But
and the widest gap on that is political empowerment, 15.2%.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have some figures from the justice sector, if you don't mind me putting.
Go for it.
Yeah, so we're talking about obviously the numbers in the political arena, but in terms of the data that we have for judiciary and for prosecutors, there's also one. So for the 2020 baseline study that we did with GDP and with the ministry, at that time the judges all over Pakistan comprised of 15%. Now in the latest study that I've done, that number has risen to 17%.
Okay.
But you have to understand that 17% of judges is not all in the senior judiciary, right? Only 1% of this 17% are women who are serving in higher judiciary.
Right.
So that's just, and because there's a different system of being recruited in the subordinate courts that's based on the examination. So I think there's no success of the higher judiciary system itself.
Yeah.
So it's still 1%, which is really bad.
Absolutely.
Prosecutors 15%, advocates, and in 2020, based on that data, we were 12% advocates altogether, but only 4% of advocates were female advocates or advocates of the Supreme Court,
Yeah.
which is another tier of how this discrimination works. JCP, the Judicial Commission of Pakistan, had 0% representation of women. Just the Sindh one in 2023 only has one woman now, which is Justice Mazda Rizvi, and I'm so glad that at least they were able to see her and not, be blind to her. As AGs, we Attorney Generals, we had 0 women. And bar councils, imagine, I mean, the representative body, barely 2%.
So the numbers, I think, are really disconcerting just across the board. So we've had the opportunity today, I think, to bring together a lot of distinct strands, across disciplines. And I think what we have kind of just as a takeaway from this conversation, I think that we have identified what the main structural and systemic issues are when it comes to female representation across all branches of government. And we've identified exactly what that does in terms of laws not being implemented in a way that is gender inclusive and gender sensitive, even where those laws exist. And secondly, where those laws don't exist, then there is a vacuum that remains in terms of the creation of policies and in terms of budgetary allocations, etc. So I think lots of really interesting points that have come up today, a lot of continuing conversations, I'm sure, that we're going to keep having, and a lot to think about and a lot to advocate for and engage constructively on. But I want to say thank you so much to everyone for being part of this conversation. I think all of your voices were invaluable. You've all added a very unique dimension to the conversation, and hopefully this will open up room for many more conversations like these.
Thank you for being a wonderful moderator.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.